evening and welcome to yet another edition of Face the Nation. Our topic of discussion today is the 20th Amendment to the Constitution and the future. Electoral reforms needed. Elections, the future. Let me introduce our guest this evening, Professor Raja Vijay Singha, parliamentarian and leader of the Liberal Party, Asoka Besekara, consultant, Verita Research, and also Mr. Asoka Abhigunawardana, Chairman, CEO, Strategic Enterprise Management Agency, and also member of the Drafting Committee of the 20th Amendment to the Constitution. Let me introduce our journalist this evening, Shahin Jurampati. On to my immediate right, on to my immediate left is beautiful Sonali Vangabadige, and on to my far left is Faraz Shaukat Ali. So let's get the ball rolling, and let's start off with Mr. Asoka Abhigunawardana, Chairman, CEO, Strategic Enterprise Management Agency. You were very optimistic about the 20th Amendment of the Constitution 2 weeks ago on the same show, Face the Nation. What is going on?
Right now, I think still it's progressing. I must say now, finally we managed to come up with the Gazette, which clearly says what the proposal is and what's the system proposed. And now there's a discussion on the contents of this. So at present, what I can understand is now there are few concerns related to the proposal, which is a combination of the proportionate basis and FPP, the first past first system. So in this setup, as I mentioned earlier, all parties originally except Mahajan Eksat Peramuna were in agreement with the method proposed. So to that extent we have achieved, and the next step was regarding the numbers. So the original proposal, which was proposed to increase the total number of seats in the parliament by 30, that's from 225 to 255, was challenged by the UNP, which says we cannot increase the total number of seats in the parliament. In that context, they came up with the alternative proposal of proposing 225. To achieve that, to use the same method, we had to introduce the number of polling divisions in the country as 125, opposed to which was proposed earlier 165. So from 165 to we have to reduce the number of polling divisions to 125, and at the end of the day, finally the president came up with the conclusion that, well, we need to have compromise. For that, the formula was the numbers were revised again, and we finally have a solution which says 145 polling divisions, 200 the proportionate basis, district proportionate basis seats, and 37 national list. So in this setup, now there are other concerns raised by mainly by the minor parties. They are coming up with two proposals. Firstly, to increase the number of polling divisions from 145 to, let's say, 155 or 160. That's the first proposal. And the second proposal, to introduce two ballot papers. If the major parties are in agreement with these two proposals, then definitely we can go ahead with this setup, and we can reach a consensus mainly among the minor parties and then with the two major parties. So I am optimistic still that we can reach a conclusion, because I don't see there's any reason not to agree the two proposals made by the two minor parties. So in this context, I think the negotiations are happening right now. By next week, we may be able to reach a consensus on this matter.
Thank you very much, Mr. Abhigunawardana, for those thoughts. Next up is Asoka Besekara, consultant, Verita Research. Asoka, what is your take on bringing about electoral reforms in the country at this juncture?
Well, I think I'm rather concerned, and I think the key thing to remember is that after our experiences sort of pre-78, the idea of proportionality and fairness are one and the same. So the concept of proportionality and preserving proportionality is essential. Now, what we know is that there are mixed electoral systems which have been promised under President Sirisena's manifesto, but the particular mixed system that we must be focusing on is the mixed member proportionate system. That is the only system which guarantees true proportionality. And when you look at the mixed member proportionate systems in any international national level legislature, you will see that the idea of the dual vote is there. Now, Professor Vijay Singha has been speaking about the dual vote for a long time. There are articles from 2012 onwards, but I mean, this is the key time that this dual vote argument has to really be made. Now, the thing that I'm finding slightly disconcerting is that the proposals which are coming about at the moment came under the framework of MMP-LK. But MMP-LK, but the key method of delivering proportionality, which is in the dual vote. And when I say in the dual vote, I'm talking about where someone can vote for a candidate and where someone can also vote for a party as well. Now, the methods of how that works we can touch on later, but it's key that it's an MMP dual voting system that we should implement. And what I find particularly disconcerting is that when this entire thing has been around numbers, someone is saying 245 plus 55 plus 37, 125 plus 75 plus 25. I mean, this is there should be democratic principles underlying this debate, and unfortunately they have been completely ignored. So we're going for something which isn't in line with international norms, in my opinion, which sort of and it ultimately deviates from what we consider fair. So I'm concerned, but I'm glad that the small parties, and these are not just ethnic minority parties, these are small parties generally, are raising this issue. And I hope that there will be some engagement on this, and the government will tell us why there is no dual vote in their proposals.
Do you think electoral reforms are needed?
Not for the reasons which are being presently given. The idea of reduction in cost without any campaign finance means that this isn't necessarily a credible idea. The idea of a reduction in violence, when really that's a law and order issue. I mean, prescribing electoral reform because we can't handle a law and order issue, I mean, that's something that we must also engage with.
Thank you very much, Asoka Besekar, consultant Better Research. We now move on to parliamentarian Professor Rajiv Vijay Singh, who is also the leader of the Liberal Party. Professor Vijay Singh, do you believe that both the opposition and government parliamentarians have a genuine interest to adopt the 20th Amendment to the Constitution? Your time starts now.
I think there is certainly a consensus that we need reform, and I'm actually very glad that now we have moved towards the principle that the Liberal Party has been advocating for 30 years. When we first advocated it, President George R. Wardner said we were trying to introduce a German system, and he, assumed that this was wrong. But as we said, you have to look at best practice. In the 90s, everyone reached a consensus on what they call the German system, but as Asoka has rightly pointed out, it was fraudulent. For instance, when GLP tried to introduce electoral reform in the mid-90s, we were in Parliament, and I remember saying, but GLP is not the German system, and he said, yes, there were some slight modifications. And it was precisely what Asoka said, that they were trying to confine people to one vote each. And let me just explain why you need two votes. The pledge of the President is to have one person per constituency, which I think is essential, for reasons I'll come to later if there's time, and then to make Parliament reflect proportionality. But if you give only one vote, the average voter is likely to vote for the person he thinks will win, which is one of the major parties. So both the minor parties all over the country, except the TNA in Jaffna, and the JVP, the JHU, will get squeezed out. Whereas if you give two votes, you vote for the party of your choice to constitute Parliament as a whole, but you get the person you want to represent you as a constituency. Now, both GLPs and then Karuja Asura in 2001 or 2, I kept telling him do it quickly, but they delayed, kept saying one vote, and the proportionality was not to compensate for the distortions of the first past the post, the distortions we saw so clearly in 1970 and in 1977, but to compensate for them, what they were trying to do was to top up. So let's say, to put it very simply, the UNP gets 45% of the vote but 70% of the seats. They were trying to give them 45% of the PR section. And the SLFP, let's say they got 40% but only 20% of the seats, would get 40. Now the German system or the New Zealand system actually says you compensate. So if the UNP gets say 70 out of 100 seats on constituencies, they would end up with 19 or 200 seat parliament, so they only get 20. The SLFP, which would have got 20 seats with 40%, deserves 80 seats, so they get 60 on the list. Now, what I found astonishing is when we started discussing this, no one had thought about it except Ashoka. In the first meeting we had at the presidential secretariat, I realized no one was thinking this whole idea of double vote. The minorities hadn't heard about it. They were complaining. And I said, but you have the double vote system. But let me say that underlying the problem is Mr. Vikram Singh's duplicity. When I raised the double vote, he said, no one wants a double vote except you. Fortunately, the rest of the minority parties said, we all want a double vote. The only exceptions were the two major parties, plus Vasudeva, and for reasons which Ashoka may explain, the JHU had some doubts about it, but I'm glad from what he said that they're coming round to it, because it's the only fair system.
Thank you very much, Professor Ajay Vijay Singh. You obviously was making reference to Mr. Abhay Gunawardena, I believe.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Professor Vijay Singh. Let's move on to the Q&A from our journalists. Let's start off with Shahin today.
Yep, thank you very much, Shamir. Professor Vijay Singh, since you're a parliamentarian, let me direct this question to you. In my opinion, I want to ask you, does Parliament seem to be in a sense of disarray as of late?
Parliament is not in a sense of disarray, but the UNP got it into its head falsely that President Sirisena's manifesto had only 2 points in it. One is get rid of the executive presidency and give all the power to Ranil, and second, to dissolve Parliament on April 23rd. Just today I heard Ajit Pareda, who's a nice man, saying they have fulfilled 80% of the promises. Rubbish. If you look at the manifesto, there are 4 clear commitments for January. One is reducing the power of the executive presidency. That has been done, and fortunately what we didn't do is transfer that to the Prime Minister, all the Prime Minister wanted. Secondly, strengthening Parliament through amending standing orders. The Prime Minister has been blocking my attempts to do this, because when I wanted to do it, we had one meeting in February, 4 things were agreed. The 5th, he said wait because he had his own plans. None of those have come before us. For 4 months he has stymied it. Third, the code of conduct. I scolded Anup Kumar Dissanayake and said, why is this code of conduct? He said, they have buried it. When I raised the issue, they suddenly remembered it. Raju Senratna said, no, Raju is completely wrong to say no one is interested. We are interested. But if you have taken a document and hidden it for 2 months without showing it, that shows you are not interested. Fortunately, they have now, after I circulated it. And fourthly and most important electoral reform, there was a pledge in the manifesto to appoint an all-party committee on January 29th. That was not done. It was completely ignored. It was only because the Sri Lanka Freedom Party said, we will support the 19th Amendment if this is done, and the President pledged to do it. And he has kept his pledge so far. I hope he'll have the strength to withstand pressures. Because of that, this was finally discussed. We only began to discuss it in March, 2 months too late. But we found that there was a remarkable movement towards consensus, and the principle that had been accepted is the top-up principle, the compensatory principle, which was never there before. So I think it's a great achievement. I find the draft that Ashoka and the rest managed to put forward very complicated. I myself, because this was delayed, I have put forward the 23rd Amendment to the Constitution, which is pure PR. It is there on the, it was put to Parliament. Unfortunately, it then goes to the Prime Minister, who can delay it. But that principle had far fewer. But I think Ashoka and his team have done a wonderful job in actually converting this whole principle. That
Professor Vijay Singh, are you in agreement with the 237 proposal put forward by the President?
I am basically in agreement with it. The 255 I think satisfies the minorities more. I don't like the numbers. I think it seems to me too much. But we have to remember what the Elections Commissioner said. It was very clear the Prime Minister was not listening to him. He said, if I have to reduce the number of constituents to 125, it will be almost impossible and lead to enormous animosity. But I can reduce it to 140 with a little bit of difficulty, but it can be done. I can certainly do this if you keep it at 165. And I think it was incumbent on us to listen to him and to move on what he said, because frankly this business about 30 more is not a problem. We always raise Parliament. But I think what we also should be looking at, which no one else but me has suggested, I wrote to Curry, is cut the perks of parliamentarians. If you think Parliament is too expensive, and I agree, reduce the perks. I have told Curry Joyce repeatedly, formalize all these perks that parliamentarians and ministers get. That is what the people want cut. The numbers are not so important. The principle that has now been agreed is vital, and I'm very glad that both my colleagues also agree with this absolutely.
Ashoka Obesekara, in your recent article titled 20A is flawed, you give an interesting scenario where you say that if a particular electorate has a contest between party X and party Y, but the voter wishes to vote for party Z, would not the voter be driven to, by virtue of the 20th Amendment, either vote for X or Y in order to ensure the lesser of two evils? Yeah. Now, you make this statement. How, in your opinion, are we to overcome the issue faced?
Well, I'll first explain the issue just and use an example as well. In the 2010 presidential election, the Northern Province voters overwhelmingly voted for General South Fonseca. Now, there was a third candidate, well, there were many candidates, but there was a third candidate, Dr. Vikramabahu Karunaratne. Now, he may well have been more palatable to the voters of the Northern Province, but they strategically used their vote to vote for General South Fonseca because they felt that there were only two candidates who had a chance of winning, and of those two candidates, they preferred General South Fonseca over former President Mahinda Rajapaksa. Now, what I contend is that logic of and it's not, it's what I call in my article the strategic voter dilemma, that this is not something new that I've come up with. There's something called Doerge's law, which specifically addresses this very thing, where when you are given a single vote, it usually leads to two-party systems. So all I'm saying is that given that scenario that I explained for the Northern Provincial Councillor, Northern Provincial voters strategic vote, that can be replicated across all of the electorates on a single vote basis. Now, given the fact that there's consensus of sorts around this idea, around this idea of constituency representation, then it's important then to be able to have this dual vote where the party vote can then be cast. So in that scenario, arguably someone who, let's say, loves the JVP, he detests the UNP and he's okay with the SLFP, he may think that it's only a contest between the SLFP and the UNP in his given electorate, but then if he has a dual vote, he can vote for the SLFP candidate for the area, but he can then vote for the JVP as a party. And as Professor Vijay Singh touched on before, it is the party vote which basically determines the composition of Parliament. So that is the key principle, and this strategic voting dilemma can be solved by implementing this dual vote.
Mr. Abhigunawardena, do you agree with what Ashoka Obesekara is saying with regard to this dual ballot paper? I am aware that you were in the drafting committee as well. Initially there was talk about increasing the number of seats to 255. Then the UNP said it should be reduced to 225, and then we had the President bringing about a solution to the entire issue and saying 237 would be the number of parliamentarians that he proposes. Do you agree with what Mr. Obesekara is saying with regard to the dual ballot paper?
Yeah, as a principle, I totally agree with this dual ballot paper issue. Now we need to consider both proposals together. Now one proposal is to increase the number of polling divisions from 145 right now proposed at least up to 160. That's one thing. Why they are proposing it, we need to understand. That's mainly because if the extent of the polling division expands, then it's likely that the communities belonging to other ethnic groups will come.
So we were in discussion with regard to the 20th Amendment to the Constitution and the future. We now move on to our Q&A from our journalists. Faraz,
could you give us some examples of this?
For instance, the duty-free vehicle.
Right.
The duty-free vehicle, I think, is something that's absolutely wrong, because everyone knows that it's sold by many people.
Right.
In fact, I didn't take one for a long time.
Yeah.
And when ministers told me, why don't you sell it, we'll find someone for you. Now, I think it's much better to do what Mr. Wickremesinghe did. You know, soon after I gave up my office, Kabir Hashim's coordinating secretaries were running around the ministry taking all my vehicles away. I told Kabir, what is this? This is disgraceful. Well, no, we wouldn't do that. They said, no, what actually happened is the Prime Minister wanted vehicles for members of Parliament. So we looked for vehicles that were going spare. And since I wasn't using my vehicles, we took all of them. But I can understand the point that give members of Parliament a vehicle to use while they're members of Parliament.
So how many are you allowed as a member?
Well, I mean, by predecessor as a minister, not as a member, was using 14. This is part of the problem. Because members don't have a right to a vehicle, it's done by subterfuge, including the duty-free thing, which everyone knows was abused. Now it's no longer abused because you're allowed to transfer immediately. So my point is, don't give them that duty-free vehicle, but allow them the use of a state vehicle while they're MPs. And make it clear that ministers should have 2 or 3, not 14 as happened in some ministries, and members can have 1. Then again, the staff. Now, when I joined Parliament, I was told you're entitled to 5 staff and my personal staff. But they actually asked me whether I wanted all the salaries paid into my account. Because according to the parliamentarians, some members of Parliament did that and then, you know, paid people much less.
But isn't it perhaps administratively easier to pay you and you pay your staff?
But it's wrong. I mean, if the government is paying somebody to work in a job that's prepared. You know, I wrote to Karu in January and I said, streamline this. One of the reasons everyone wants to be a minister is ministers get many more perks. So I said, cut those perks. And you know, I think one of the major problems we face is that no one looks at the reality of where the money is being wasted. I think having 30 more MPs or 12 more MPs is not a major problem. The problem lies in the perks. Look at the number of police. I mean, I have 2 people. I was punished when I voted against didn't vote for the Chief Justice. I had 3 policemen, it was cut to 2. Some of my colleagues have 5 policemen. These are paid for by the country. Why? When we had a terrorist movement, it made sense. But why is so much money
Are you
wasted on
supposed to
them?
wash your car? Or?
Well, I think some people used it to wash their cars. So other people used them to sweep their compounds, the poor policemen. This should not be allowed.
Ms. Abhigawardhan, we were talking about the 4-member committee that was appointed and was looking into electoral reforms. How long were you all?
Well, that I was trying to explain now. From 2003 onwards until 2010, there was a parliamentary process.
That's right.
Which came up with the idea of this Dinesh Kumar Committee Board. Now we started from that point. Now that had a constraint between 225. They couldn't accommodate the targets they were trying, so it was increased to 255. Still, that method did not work because we couldn't ensure that minor parties and the minority parties will get at least the same number of seats, despite the fact that numbers are increased by 30.
So this committee was working on the electoral reforms for 13 long years.
No. I mean, now after the presidential election, this process initiated again, and then that progressed. So,
was the Dinesh Kunwardhan committee report or committee suggestions taken into account?
Well, that was the proposal submitted by the SLFP to the cabinet on April 29. And UNP proposed the New Zealand method. So those 2 proposals were presented, and at that meeting, actually the president wanted us to review and to make sure that all parties can come to an agreement.
Do you think that we have the right system in place now?
Of these 2 is the outcome of what we are discussing right now.
Do we have the right system in place now?
I mean the current proposal.
That's right.
Yeah, I think this particular...
But you just said that the dual ballot paper also needs to be introduced. It seems that the drafting committee itself do not have a say on what needs to be done.
Yeah.
Professor Jayasinghe, has this been drafted based on the whim of political party representatives?
Not as far as I know. I was not invited, which I'm sorry about, because as you know, on elections I probably have been studying this for longer than anybody else. But, you know, I say things that are unpopular, as you know, and perhaps achieving a consensus, I'm the wrong person. But I was very impressed with Asoka, because in March when this came up first, I realized he had a full grasp of it. I think the one thing that he should have introduced was the dual ballot.
Yeah.
And I think it's absolutely clear that even the minorities will not press for the 165 if there's a dual ballot. Because I think if you have a dual ballot, you will get what the President pledged in his manifesto, which is a parliament that reflects the will of the people, and for the reasons Asoka has pointed out.
Let me explain why this issue arose. Now, the fact is that now we cannot have now the minority parties. There are two different categories. One category is that they are concentrated in certain areas. The other is distributed. So, for the distributed minor parties, we need this mainly the two ballot papers. But there are minority parties which have certain higher concentration in certain areas. They are concentrating on the polling divisions. So we need to accommodate both. That's the first thing. Now, purely introducing the dual ballot paper will not comfort the minority communities like the upcountry Tamils and certain parts in Muslim areas, and because of that reason, we need to accommodate both. So the core issue we face is not. We were in agreement with introducing two ballot papers. The issue was the national overhanging. If we are to accommodate fair share for the proportionate the FPPs, that's the polling division, then that should be within 160. If you do that, then if you are to introduce two ballot papers, then the total number of seats in the parliament should increase by another 10, that's from 255 to 265. So the issue was certain parties were against this increasing the total numbers, and the others were against reducing the polling divisions. That was the key issue for not being able to come to a
I mean, this issue around overhang, I must say I disagree with, in the sense that overhang is an issue when you say you need 100% proportionality, and therefore this idea of overhang is when you have to slightly increase the number of seats in parliament to accommodate enough MPs to ensure that the composition of parliament is correctly sort of balanced out. Now, really, what can even be done? I mean, it's not a hard and fast rule with some of these things. I mean, you can still say that you will have a certain, I mean, even the 237 members, you can have the 237 members of parliament. The chances of an overhang, I mean, I believe, Mr. Abegunawardena, your thinking behind the overhang is also based on your simulations of past elections as well. And this idea of simulations of past elections is a highly problematic one. Yes. Because simulations of past elections are people who are going to the polling booth without that strategic voter dilemma which I had been mentioning before. So, I mean, there are lots of different factors. I just want to say that there's one other factor which I think should be considered here. Now, this is the op-ed written by Honourable Minister Champika Ranawaka earlier this month, and I just focus on one thing that he said here. He said, under the PR system, no party has been able to get a healthy majority to form a stable government except in 89 and 2010, both of which were exceptions in their own right. The governments have often been at the mercy of minority groups and compelled to give in to their unreasonable demands, be they racist, fundamentalist or irrational. Now, my contention is that now the JHU isn't supportive of the dual ballot, whilst other small parties are. And when I see Honourable Minister Champika Ranawaka actually being quite honest and saying this, what he's saying here is that there is a desire for a degree of majoritarianism. And now you either, I mean, an MMP is a mixed member proportionate system. There are mixed member majoritarian systems as well, which have single ballots. So maybe this may be an insight into potentially the direction in which this debate has gone.
Thank you very much. We're now going for a short commercial break. When we come back, we will be discussing about the 20th Amendment of the Constitution and the future of the country. Thank you very much.